For attendance today. My name is Ian McLean and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule today to hear from the Canadian Ambassador to the United States, David MacNaughton. We appreciate his presence with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we do live and work on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples as we seek a renewed relationship built on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. As always, these events never can take place without the generous support of our membership and in particular our sponsors. I'd like to take just a few minutes to thank our sponsors. BlackBerry Limited is our presenting sponsor today, Robert Island and his team. Thanks so much for your participation. Our silver sponsors, BDO Canada. Where is the BDO gang? There they are over here. Thank you. As well as Gowling WLG. Where are they? They're at the back. Bryce Craker and his gang. Sun Life Financial. They're somewhere in the crowd over here. Thank you, Sun Life. And to our host here at the Crown Plaza, Kitchener-Waterloo. I'd like to introduce just a few folks that are in attendance today in the audience. My colleague, Greg DeRocher, who's the President and CEO of the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for being here, Greg. He and I host Business to Business on 570 News and doing an interview with a certain someone at the conclusion of this event. So it's good to have Greg cross the 401, but only for you, Ambassador. It's the only time he comes across the border. We also have some of our elected officials, Mayor Barry Vervanovic, the City of Kitchener. We also have Mayor Sandy Shantz from the Township of Woolwich. Chief Brian Larkin, a police chief of the Waterloo Regional Police Force. Thank you for being here. In addition, we have, I think Councillor Diane Freeman is here from the City of Waterloo. Councillors Zig Yanecki and John Gazzola from City of Kitchener over here. Councillors Sean Strickland, Tom Galloway, and Elizabeth Clark. I think I've got everyone from the Region of Waterloo Council. And pleased that many members of our board are joining us today. Chair Renata Rosiniak from Manulife, who is somewhere over here. Thank you, Renata. Scott Gilfillan from PwC. Julie Barker-Mers from Bank of Montreal. And Sean Sullivan from Gowling's WLG. In addition, a couple of our past chairs, Murray Costello from Union Gas, a Spectra energy company right at the back. And sitting beside him is Paul Eichinger from MTE, and Tim Southern, the tallest guy in the room. He's got the chief by a nose from BDO. Thank you for joining us and for your support of the Chamber. We have a very busy event season this fall, so I just draw your attention to a couple of them. On October the 29th, we'll be hosting our annual 100-mile feast at the Delta Waterloo. It's an opportunity for us to highlight local food, some of the culinary expertise we have from the food industry and chefs locally, all trying to use ingredients from close to Waterloo region. And the theme this year is Experience Greece, and we're really looking forward to that. It's going to be a fantastic evening. We have a live auction as part of that is in support of physician recruitment program that brings family doctors here to the region of Waterloo. On November 15th, we'll be having the second in our Waterloo Economic Development Series, and it's going to be focused on scaling. And we're going to hear the story from Mike Galbraith, who's the Senior Vice President of Finance at Thalmic Labs. So it should be a fascinating event, and that is partnering with our friends from Waterloo EDC. And did I mention that Waterloo EDC is one of our sponsors today? Because I don't think I did. I did do that? Okay, if I didn't, I should have. But we're pleased to be focusing on scaling because there are many companies that are in that mode right now here in the region of Waterloo. And on November 22nd, the second in our MNP Networking Breakfast Series at the Inn of Waterloo. And we're very pleased to have the CEO of Axonify, Carol Lehman, who is a serial entrepreneur and successful businesswoman here in the region, to talk about her award-winning workplace culture and what every business can take away from her success. I hope you enjoy your lunch. We'll get started in about 30 minutes, and I look forward to the rest of the program. Thank you. Your lunch, and enjoy dessert that's on the table, and there's coffee in front of you. I think we'll get started with the program. So if I'd just like to introduce in just a moment Robert Aislin, who's Senior Director for Government Relations and Public Policy at BlackBerry, will be doing a fireside chat with Ambassador MacNaughton. So at the conclusion of the Ambassador's introductory remarks, they'll have about 45 minutes to drill down on some of the issues that are of interest to us all. But before that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker from today. David MacNaughton presented his credentials as Canada's ambassador to the United States on March 3rd, 2016. As a seasoned entrepreneur and political strategist, Mr. MacNaughton brings a unique set of skills and experiences to his role as ambassador. In the 1980s, Mr. MacNaughton transformed his public affairs industry by building an organization that comprised government relations, public opinion research, and public relations. After selling his business in 1989, he became president of Canada's largest government and public relations firm, and subsequently North American president of the world's largest public relations firm. From 1995 to 2003, Mr. MacNaughton was president of Strathshore Financial and was an advisor to one of Canada's leading investment banks. His public sector experience includes work at both the federal and provincial levels, including as an advisor to the Minister of Departments of Transport, Industry, and Foreign Affairs. He was Principal Secretary to the Premier of Ontario from 2003 to 2005, and the Chairman of Strategy Corp from 2005 until his appointment. Active in community affairs, Mr. MacNaughton has served on the boards of the North York General Hospital, the Stratford Festival, the National Ski Academy, TV Ontario, the Toronto French School, and the Toronto International Film Festival. Pleased he's joined today by his partner, Leslie Noble, a good friend of mine from years past, and we welcome you to our chamber event today. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador David MacNaughton.
Thanks very much, Ian, and it's really a pleasure to be here in Waterloo Region. And what I'm going to try and do, I know Robert is going to have all sorts of questions for me, and I really enjoy the Q&A process better than the speeches, but I will try to give you a little bit of a flavor of what the relationship between Canada and the United States is like right now, some of the things that we've been going through over the last several months, and what I see in the months and years ahead. Obviously, when I was appointed ambassador in early March of 2016, no one knew exactly what was going to happen in the U.S. election. I remember having the Prime Minister had a cabinet retreat in Sudbury in late August, and I was asked to give a presentation as to what I thought was going to happen. And I said at the time that all of the smart people in Washington were predicting that Hillary Clinton would be president, that the Democrats would take the Senate, and the Republicans would hold the House. And I gave a caveat after that by saying that in the past 18 months, all of the smart people in Washington had been wrong all of the time. And they were wrong once again. Obviously, one of the things that we decided to do after the election of President Trump was to try to build a very strong relationship with the new administration, to try to find ways to, notwithstanding some fairly substantial policy differences, to find areas where we could cooperate, where we could forge a good working relationship. And also, because of the nature of the American system and its governance, we also tried to build strong relationships at both in the Senate and in the House and among governors right across the country. And also with the business community in the United States, because what I came to realize fairly soon after being appointed, and should have realized before, is that notwithstanding the fact that the Americans always say, we love Canada, we love Canadians, we think you're really nice people, when it comes down to commercial interests, they do what's in their best interest. And so we had to make sure that we actually were able to convince them that having a strong trading relationship, positive trading relationship with Canada was not just in our interest, but was in theirs. That, obviously, with Trump campaigning actively against NAFTA, saying it was the worst trade deal that had ever been done, the renegotiation of that trading agreement, which is so important to all of us in North America, but vitally important to Canada, was going to be a struggle. The biggest difference, and I think one of the things that all of our people had to get their heads around and internalize, was that most of the time when you enter into a trading negotiation, there is, at least among those who are doing the negotiation, whether it be a bilateral one or a multilateral one, a sense that the purpose, the outcome that is desired, is to build trade, grow the size of the pie, not simply argue over how to cut it up, although that is obviously part of a trading negotiation. But if you're thinking about something that is going to grow, then you can easily get into a give and take discussion during the course of the negotiations. The President's stated objective, and some of his key trade people's stated objective in NAFTA, was not a growing of the pie. It was a rebalancing, as they said. They were particularly focused in the early stages on Mexico and particularly on autos. The President has a focus on trade deficits, and the trade deficit, particularly on autos with Mexico, was something in the neighborhood of $80 billion. He did say early on that as far as Canada was concerned, he was really more interested in tweaking, some tweaking. In any case, we began the negotiations with some hope that the focus would be on making North America even more competitive, of growing the trading relationship and being able to more effectively compete against some of the other big trading blocs in the world, whether it be the EU, Asian countries, or China in particular, China and India. But it became quite obvious in the early stages that that was not the focus of the negotiation, and it became even more obvious as we went along. I want to highlight two or three times where I think there were significant developments that changed the nature of the negotiation, and then talk a little bit about what the outcome was. In January of this year, or up until January of this year, the Americans had been insisting on 50% domestic content in the rules of origin as far as autos are concerned. So 50% of all of the vehicles and their component parts were going to have to be made in the United States of America. That particular provision, had it prevailed, would have devastated the Canadian automobile industry, because the combination of a defined amount of American production plus cheap Mexican labor would have put Canada at a permanent disadvantage, competitive disadvantage, and in fact would have led fairly soon to closing of many of the plants and an incentive for the parts manufacturers to move to both the United States and Mexico. In late January, we came up with a counter-proposal, which was not to have any national content provisions, but to incorporate in the rules of origin a factor which would give a bonus for parts that were made in plants that paid their workers $16 an hour or more. What that clearly did was it meant all of the facilities in Canada qualified. Most of them in the United States did, although there was some discussion around some of the right-to-work states like Mississippi, but obviously put us in a different position vis-a-vis Mexico, and more or less put us on the same side of the table as the Americans in terms of negotiating the auto. The immediate reaction of the Americans was to ridicule our proposal. Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade representative, said in Montreal that these were ridiculous proposals. that were dead in the water. 2 weeks later, we met at USTR, and the first thing that Bob said was the much maligned Canadian proposals apparently have some merit. He didn't acknowledge that he was the one that had been maligning them. But it really did change the nature of the discussions, because as I know most of you know, whether it be in terms of auto production, in terms of parts, in terms of the supply chain, the automotive sector is extremely important to all of Canada and is particularly important to Ontario. So that led to a series of productive discussions. Obviously, there were many other items on the table, including intellectual property, where there was some very sharp differences of opinion, and something called supply management and dairy. The talks dragged on, again, mostly because of the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that we had not resolved the auto stuff, but it was going in a much more productive way, the Americans were still very much in the mode of saying, here are our proposals, take it or leave it. Things like the sunset clause, which said that after 5 years, the agreement would automatically end unless all three parties agreed to renew it. It was obviously something that we could not live with, and the Americans were very clear about it. They said, what we really want to do is to create uncertainty in the market so people will invest in the United States rather than investing in Canada and Mexico. And that was clearly something we couldn't live with. We needed to have something, we need to have a robust dispute resolution mechanism, whether that be Chapter 19 or Chapter 20, both of which have been very important to Canada. Chapter 19 has been the one where we have been able to challenge the rulings that the Americans have made under softwood lumber, and we have won significantly under that particular provision. And some people, when we were going through this, said, well, when this started, there was no WTO. What's wrong with just relying on the WTO to deal with some of these disputes? And the answer to that was really twofold. One of them is the Americans have not shown any particular interest in making the WTO more effective, particularly when it comes to dispute resolution. And the other factor in the matter is that when the tariffs come on softwood lumber, they are held in escrow, and if you win under Chapter 19, the tariffs are given back to the companies that have paid them. And so that was a pretty significant difference between going to the WTO, where if you win a ruling, all you get to do is to retaliate. So we felt that Chapter 19 was absolutely critical in terms of the preservation. We did not want to have a sunset clause that looked anything like the 5 years. And we wanted to make sure that the foundation of the rules-based agreement was going to be preserved. We knew all along that there were going to be things that we were going to have to give at the table, but we were pretty confident that if we could resolve the automobile differences, ultimately we would get to a deal that was satisfactory for Canada. In late April, there was a flurry of activity which really was with regard to trying to get the deal done so that it could get approved by this Congress. And there's some statutory timeframes within which their process has to work, and if we didn't get something done by the end of April or early May, it was going to be impossible to get it approved within the lame duck Congress that ends in December of this year. And we came reasonably close to getting something done, but again, on some of the key items like Chapter 19, Chapter 20, and the sunset clause, we were not far enough along for us to be able to get an agreement. After the Mexican election, and this is another sort of pivotal point in the negotiations, we agreed that the Mexicans and the Americans should try to resolve their differences in the automotive sector. And what the Mexicans were particularly concerned about was that there were a number of new plants in Mexico that were not going to be able to meet the rules of origin criteria that we had all agreed to, and that those plants would have to close unless there was some transitional rules that allowed them to continue to exist under the old rules, at least for some period of time. We had agreed with Mexico and with the Americans that the discussions that would take place in July following the Mexican election would be principally on bilateral things between Mexico and the United States, and would leave the multilateral ones to a tripartite negotiation. As it turned out, that isn't what happened. There were a number of the items, including Chapter 19 and the Sunset Clause, that were dealt with by the Mexicans and the Americans at the table. And I think what happened was that the U.S. Thought that the best way to negotiate with us was to present us with a fait accompli and say, you're either on board or you're not, and you better get with the program or else. That didn't go over so well with our side, as you can imagine. And so we began to engage with them in terms of the substance of the matter. We did reach an agreement fairly quickly on some of the outstanding IP items, which they gave us some of the protection that we were looking for in terms of our company's intellectual property. We did have to give up on some things like biologics and the extension of patent protection for pharmaceuticals, which obviously is going to cost provincial governments a significant amount of money over the next several years. But we were reasonably satisfied with where we got. The Mexicans had bargained with the Americans a better sunset clause. It was essentially a 16-year time frame before there would be any termination of the agreement. And as I think most of you know, within the NAFTA agreement, the original NAFTA agreement, there was a provision which allowed any party to get out on 6 months' notice. So while we weren't completely happy with the sunset clause that was incorporated, it was significantly better than what was originally proposed, and we felt we could probably live with that if we got some of the other items. What happened then was that the Americans basically said, and the Mexicans, was the Mexicans do not want to have the new president. New president doesn't want to sign this new agreement. They want the previous administration to sign off on it before the new Mexican president takes over on December the 1st. And there is a time frame within which this has to be presented to Congress before the Americans can sign off on an agreement in principle. And so you've got 3 weeks to get this all done. Well, it was probably the most challenging 3 weeks I've ever spent. There was very little sleep. There was obviously a lot of tension, and we went right up to the last minute, as one usually does in these things. The outcome was, I think, something that if you told me a month ago this is what was going to happen, I would not have believed it was possible. We were able to secure Chapter 19 unchanged, no modifications. We had significant disputes over the use of the National Security Clause 232 that currently is impacting on our steel and aluminum industry. And the president had threatened to use 232 on autos. And obviously, had a 25% tariff come in on our automobile industry, it would have devastated our economy and put us into recession in a very, very short period of time. What my concern about that, and our concern generally, was that even if he didn't do it, the very specter of that hanging out there was going to fundamentally change the investment climate here in Canada. And so we decided that what we would try to do is not just to get them to agree not to impose the 232 tariffs on autos in the short term, but to have some kind of an insurance policy against them doing it in the future. And what we got was essentially two components. One of them was that on autos, there will be no imposition of 232 unless and until there is a 70% increase in auto production in Canada. And I can tell you, if we have a 70% increase in auto production in Canada, I think everybody would be pretty happy about it. But it isn't a quota. It is, as I said, an insurance policy. It gives people the confidence that they can invest in the automotive sector, both in terms of the OEMs and in terms of the parts and in terms of the entire supply chain, without the fear that some president in the future, this one or someone in the future, can simply on a whim say, oh, well, Canada's a national security threat, we're going to put a tariff in place. And we were extraordinarily happy about that. The original proposal, our best year ever of car production, I think was 900,000 units. And they started off by saying, well, we'll give you a cushion which is up to 1.2. We ended up at 1.6. So that component we were really pleased with. The second thing that I was very happy that we were able to secure was this 60-day consultation process for the imposition of any 232 measure. And the reason for that is that I can't tell you the number of times over the last 2.5 years when the Americans have done something on a trade file and it's designed to get at China or India or Russia or whomever, but they apply it across the board and we say, but you know, that's going to impact on us. Why are you doing it against us? And they say, oh yeah, we didn't realize it was going to hurt you, but there's nothing we can do about it now because it's in place and we don't want to have to back down, and if we have to back down for you, we're going to have to back down for somebody else. And in this provision means that no matter what they do in 232 in terms of imposing those tariffs on somebody, we have a 60-day consultation process during which we can make the case that they shouldn't be doing it. And you know, the reality is, even to have a pause which allows us to make our case, I think is going to be significant in the future. The other thing that you know, became clear as we got closer and as the negotiations began to get more intense was that a lot of the work that we had done in Congress and with the U.S. business community and the U.S. labor community was starting to pay off. There were significant, you know, people in the Senate who were very close to the administration who weren't making a big deal of it publicly, but I know privately were saying to the president, we're not going to let this agreement go through. We will not sign off on this agreement unless Canada's part of it. And we could detect in the last 2 weeks a shift in the attitude of the Americans. They clearly never were going to roll over or be easy to deal with, but it became clear to us that they actually wanted to have a deal. And up until that time, I was not convinced that the president wasn't going to be just as comfortable continuing to run against NAFTA rather than to have to defend a deal that he had done. So that was a really important thing, and I think it's an important lesson for us all, is that now that the deal is signed off, we still have to go through congressional approval in the future, but we are so dependent on U.S. trade that we can never forget that we need to continue to build those relationships, whether it be at the governor level, whether it be in the Congress, whether it be with U.S. business, with U.S. labor, because they are the ones who are going to be most effective in pleading Canada's case. Having said that, and I'll end these remarks with one other comment, and that is that we would never have been able to get to where we got to without the support of Canadians right across the country. I spent a lot of time meeting with provincial premiers from Newfoundland all the way to British Columbia and the territories, met with business leaders across the country and labor leaders, and with parliamentarians of all sides of the House. And what really made a difference was the Team Canada approach, where all of the premiers and all of the business organizations that I spoke with and the labor leaders were trying to help and be constructive. And whether it was Premier Wall of Saskatchewan, who I asked to go and appear at a Canada Day celebration in Sioux City, Iowa, or you know, the Premier of Newfoundland, or members of the opposition, and many of the cabinet ministers, including Barta Shager from here, who always were prepared, no matter what they were doing, to roll up their sleeves and try and do whatever they could to be supportive. And those, that kind of support was absolutely, you know, without precedent, I think, in this country. I have never seen in all of my career anything where Canadians have rallied around and been as supportive. And it is inevitable when the deal gets done that there are going to be critics. Fair enough. I don't have any problem with that. I do sometimes have a little bit of a problem with some of the people who said to me 2 months ago, I don't care what the deal is, please just get it done, who now say that they could have got a better deal. But I mean, that's you do hear that occasionally. But you know, I'm quite proud of what we accomplished under the circumstances. We had you know, dozens and dozens of hardworking public servants who dedicated hours after hour, gave up on family time, and really provided unbelievable support to Minister Freeland and our team that were negotiating this. It was extraordinarily challenging and difficult, but I am very happy that I was part of it. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience, but I don't think I ever want to go through it again. So thank you all very much. I must say one thing. You know, I've been traveling around the U.S. quite a bit, out to San Francisco, Seattle a lot, and in Massachusetts. I've been to Boston several times. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is to say to Americans who are looking at Canada, I say, well, you know, what would it take for you to make a significant investment in Canada? And one of the things that comes back all the time is people. They want to have access to highly skilled people. And whenever they start talking about Canada and highly skilled people, invariably Waterloo Region comes up. The name that you have built, the reputation that you've built in terms of a center of excellence, of innovation, is quite remarkable. And I can tell you everywhere I go, it is raised. I know that there were and have been, you know, concerns about the brain drain of people going from Canada into the Silicon Valley and elsewhere. I think that is starting to reverse. And I have talked to people, significant investor in the U.S. who went from Canada to Silicon Valley many years ago and has made an awful lot of money and has now decided that he just raised $750 million and he is moving half of his operation to Ontario and the other half to Austin, Texas, and moving out of the Silicon Valley. So I think, you know, it will still remain a vibrant hub, as will Boston, but I think we are gaining a reputation. We used to be known in Canada for our natural resources, and I think we're getting a reputation now for our human resources. So to all of you who've been part of the dynamic industry that goes on here in Waterloo Region, I say congratulations. I think the future is extraordinarily bright, and certainly the Embassy in Washington and our whole network throughout the United States, we're there to be helpful and to do whatever we can to help build this region. So thank you very much, and look forward to the questions.
Ambassador, it's great to see you.
Good to see you.
On behalf of BlackBerry, just want to say how pleased we are to sponsor this event, to be a leader in the community. Ambassador, I think you very insightfully explained the process of the last 2 years, last year especially. If you're a business leader right now and you look at this new agreement, what would you say are the 2, 3 big takeaways?
Well, I think, the most important thing is that I think we've got a degree of certainty now. Even though we still have to go through an approval process and in the United States and in Canada and in Mexico, the threat of having that market either not necessarily disappear, but become way more challenging, I think is gone. I think the other thing is that now, we've still got some challenges. We've got to get rid of the tariffs on aluminum and steel. And they are going to continue to try to use their trade remedy laws. But those are things that we've been dealing with for a long time. The other thing, too, is that, if I look at not just securing access to the U.S. market, but the CPTPP and the CETA, is that we now have free trade agreements that span most of the globe. Obviously, there's China and India and some places in South America we don't, but we have a significantly opened up markets. And frankly, because the Americans chose not to be part of TPP, they don't have an agreement with Europe. I think there are great opportunities for us to get into those markets while maintaining our access to the U.S. market.
You mentioned in your presentation that the Kenyan team had red lines, and you talked about Chapter 19 as one of the absolute things that we were not ready to concede on. What made them change their mind? Like, what happened? How convincing were you to make change their mind?
I don't know fully what happened. I think that they thought that they were going to be able to introduce some modifications that would have essentially gutted Chapter 19. I think, we repeated over and over, and I think in early September, the Prime Minister made a speech out in Edmonton where he made it quite clear that that was not something we were going to entertain. I think also, I mentioned that we detected that for the first time in the last 2 weeks, they really did seem to be interested in getting a deal, and I think they had by that time internalized the fact that that Chapter 19 was just something that they couldn't get rid of. It was really, Ambassador Lighthizer has spoken against Chapter 19 for years and years and years. It's been part of his thing. I think that perhaps, I don't know, but I think that probably Jared Kushner was probably helpful in terms of helping to convince the president that some of the other parts of the package were good enough to allow him to claim victory and to have it be a positive in the midterms. So I think a whole series of things, but you never know what goes on in the other person's camp. It was hard enough for me to know what was going on in ours.
I'm sure it was. I want to talk about auto for a second, given the centrality of automotive and rules of origin in the deal. You mentioned that you had spent the first part of the negotiation on that issue with Mexico and Canada. There are some concerns, I guess, that because of the new rules of origin, the North American industry will be less competitive because the cars will be more expensive as a result of the new rules. What can you say about our competitiveness as a continent now for the auto sector compared to Asia and other?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a legitimate concern. It's one that we were conscious of and discussed with the automobile companies and with the parts manufacturers and various components of the supply chain. I hope, and I was speaking with somebody from one of the automobile companies yesterday, and they were still going through all of the details of the agreement, really looking at that. And what we're hoping, and I don't know, I hope this is true, is that that we can reduce some of the regulatory burden, which will reduce the cost, so they don't have to. I mean, under the tracing provisions in the previous agreement, there was an awful lot of paperwork that needed to be done and everything else. And so, we're hopeful that we will not have put the North American industry at a competitive disadvantage. I don't think there's any question. Now, while obviously having a cheap labor part of your supply chain was important, I think that's going to become less important in the future. The labor component of automobiles has been going down quite dramatically over the last half dozen years, and I think over the next half dozen years, advanced manufacturing is going to, and robotics and everything is going to drive that down even further. So I hope what this gives us enough certainty that the supply chain can invest in the technology and the kind of things that are going to make us more competitive.
Invest more in BlackBerry. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, you do have some interest in
We
that.
do, we do. Similarly, the region is known for its tech sector, obviously, and you mentioned you had to make some concession on intellectual property. What can you say that were the main challenges, and how did you go about it?
Well, there were a number of things that people raised with us. Some of them are, it was interesting to hear people within Canada on opposite sides of arguments. I mean, if some people wanted more protection because they are creators, and some of them wanted less protection because they were consumers. But there were a couple of things that people raised with us that were of particular concern, patent trolling and venue shopping. And while we weren't able to get it completely fixed, and I gather that there were many instances where courts in East Texas have, always go with not with the person who's defending the patent, but the others. And we've got an agreement with the Americans to deal with that issue. It's a complex thing to deal with, but what we're really seeking is what the American companies have got, which is protection against venue shopping. And if we can get national treatment on that, then it'll give tremendous protection to some of our companies. But the big thing that we actually had to give on from a cost point of view was the pharmaceutical thing, and that had more to do with their feeling about which senators they could get on side to get the agreement passed than any great deep philosophical thing, and perhaps the pharmaceutical industry has been active. I hope what the result of this is that with some of the changes that do give extra protection, that we'll see some investment in Canada that hasn't been there for the last number of years.
Right. Another thing you mentioned that we had to give on was supply management, dairy, and I knew there are people in the region doing food processing and that business, and the Prime Minister mentioned food, that after those discussions there'll be likely compensation. What can you say about that?
Well, what happened was that their initial demand was that we get rid of our supply management system on dairy, on poultry, and on eggs. We did not agree to that and would not agree to that. What ended up happening was that we had to give access to our market. And on dairy, it was about 3.6%, about the same as under TPP. And some of the TPP access we gave people like Australia and New Zealand can't use because it's hard to ship fluid milk from New Zealand over here. So we think that at the end of the day, the Canadian dairy industry is still going to have 90% of the market, to the degree that there is going to be damage done to whether it be individuals or sectors or certain parts of it. There will be compensation. It's a bit complicated to figure out exactly who's going to get hit and what that compensation should be done. That's happening with your friends at finance right now. So when they've finished that, we'll be consulting with stakeholders. It was a particularly difficult part of the negotiations, and obviously we had to keep in touch with the industry, and I know that they're not all wildly happy. But having said that, 90% share is still pretty good.
It was one where we felt that the president personally felt it was really important politically to achieve, so obviously hard to dodge.
There was no question that the dairy thing had become a big focus of his, and I think that it was unrealistic for us to think that we were going to be able to get an agreement without dealing with some kind of access. And then it was a complicated thing because of the introduction of diafiltered milk, the skim milk powder from the U.S. to try and get around our supply management system, and then our industry came up with their own version of it. I mean, it's a long story that I never really want to have to go through again. But I know way too much about dairy and way too much about rules of origin.
I'm sure. One thing that is not resolved, and you mentioned it in your remarks, is steel and aluminum tariffs.
Yeah.
What are we going to do about this?
Well, there are two things. One of them is there's quite a difference between the aluminum sector and the steel sector and its role within the North American economy. The Americans, even if they brought all of their aluminum smelters up to full production, would only have about 25% of the U.S. market. They depend on aluminum from Canada for a significant component of their market, and it is a very strategic thing because so much of it goes into the military. And what we have been arguing is that their tariffs on Canadian aluminum really make it easier for people like Russia and China to access the market because they're non-market economies. And so it may punish us, not just the primary producers, but obviously people that are moving aluminum back and forth across the border to create secondary manufacturing, and that in fact, from a national security point of view, they're diminishing their national security rather than enhancing it. It's the same case as we're making on uranium as to why they shouldn't do it on uranium. Steel's a little bit different in the sense that, they're not as vulnerable in the steel sector as they are in the aluminum sector, but we are going to be making the case there too. And I think, at the end of the day, they have said, well, we'll take the tariffs off if you accept quotas. And the problem with that is that we have facilities that are shut in Hamilton, the Stelco facility that was owned by U.S. Steel, and I find it somewhat, perverse that U.S. Steel is now petitioning that we shouldn't be able to send any steel down to the U.S. without 25% tariffs. I think we're going to work through it. I would hope that they would lift the tariffs on aluminum quickly, and I would like to see them lift them on steel too. If we ended up getting some kind of an agreement that is kind of like the autos, where there's an insurance policy that would allow some investment to take place in places like the Sioux and in Hamilton, then we could live with something like that too. But I don't want to get into a pure managed trade agreement with them on steel or aluminum.
Right. One area that we feel that the president, where the end game is not that clear, is with China. And they're very aggressive, obviously. We feel that, now that the North American deal is behind him, he feels very strongly going hard after China with tariffs. But it's not clear what the end game is, where this will end. What are your thoughts on that and the impact on Canada being squeezed a bit in the middle on this?
Well, you know, as in most things, the president and some of his closest advisors are, you know, have a view that the only thing that measures fairness and health of a relationship is whether you have a trade surplus or a trade deficit. Obviously, you know, I don't agree with that, but that doesn't matter. He's the president of the United States, and he does. So they're very focused on that particular issue. I think that they run the risk of taking what is an extraordinarily vibrant U.S. economy at the present moment, which is kind of humming on all cylinders, and creating either some combination of inflation and or you know, a real slowdown because the benefit that people got from the tax cuts can be taken away from by the tariffs. And I don't know how consumers are going to react at Christmas if they go to the Walmart and things are going to cost a lot more. I know that already agricultural interests in the U.S. are quite upset about losing access, whether it be in soybeans or on pork or any other things. And again, I think it without talking too much about it, it creates some opportunities for Canadians as long as they're but ultimately having a you know, a big trade war between the United States and China is not in anybody's interest. And I would hope that, you know, perhaps we can help play a role to agree with the Americans on some of the areas where we find the Chinese are not behaving properly, and whether that's through the WTO or whether that's through, you know, getting a group of countries together to be supportive of the Americans on the issues that we really do agree with them on, and whether we can try to bring the temperature down. I would hope so, because I just don't think that this is going to be in anybody's interest if it lasts for a long time.
Yeah. On the Canadian-U.S. relationship, obviously there's a lot of relief right now, but there's also a sense of a bit of resentment on the way we were treated sometimes by this administration, a sense of bullying maybe. What do you say about the future of that relationship, and what can be done now to move forward in a more positive way?
Well, you know, it's you know, this isn't the first time that there have been tensions between a Canadian administration and a U.S. administration. I can tell you that you know, I get along extremely well with quite a number of them. Sonny Perdue is a you know, the agriculture secretary is a good friend. You know, I get along well with Lighthizer. You know, it's been difficult, but the communication is good. You know, the Prime Minister's office and the White House do talk and talk frequently. So I think some of it is, you know, there are definitely some bruises. But the other thing about this is that our relationship with the United States is so broad and so deep. Last week I had a reception at the embassy we call Partners in Defense, and we had 125 U.S. military, senior U.S. military people, and 125 of our people, including our Chief of Defense Staff. The Commandant of the Marine Corps was there from the United States. And when you see them together and they tell about how they work together around the world, it's really quite remarkable. And I think the same thing exists between the FBI and the RCMP and the Customs and Border Patrol. And, you know, we have this on the Great Lakes, the people used to get in fast boats and smuggle back and forth, and it was really difficult because it was an American coming across to Canada. The Coast Guard would be trying to catch them. They get over to the Canadian side and kind of wave at them, and vice versa. And so the RCMP and the Coast Guard said, well, why don't we just put each of us on the ship? So we got a fleet, and there's an RCMP and a Coast Guard on the same boat. So whatever side you catch them, that's the person who arrests them. And, you know, I mean, but can you imagine that happening between Italy and Germany or something? I mean, like, it just, you know, it wouldn't happen. So I think that, and I just everywhere, you know, you look at when there are hurricanes and, you know, Ontario Hydro crews go down to help out and vice versa. So, you know, and I consider half a dozen of the U.S. governors as friends. Just before we got down to the short strokes on the NAFTA thing, I had one of the U.S. senators call me and said, there are a group of us that'd like to come over and, you know, talk to you, have dinner with you at your embassy, and talk about the relationship. And there were 15 of them that showed up, you know, half Democrats and half Republicans. I mean, it's a very, very strong relationship. I think, and I said to them, you know, had they imposed 232 on autos, it would have damaged the relationship for a generation. And thank goodness we were able to avoid that, because that's not in either one of our interests.
In closing, maybe one question more on the personal side. And you've been through a lot in your career at various levels. But, you know, what have you learned? What must have been such a roller coaster, as you mentioned in your initial remarks. One week, you seemed like it was going somewhere, and then, you know, nowhere, and then, you know, always going back and negotiating the things that you thought were going to be settled. So what were the main lessons for you personally?
Well, I think it's a lesson that you know, I've kind of been aware of all of my life, but you know, was really impressed on me throughout all of this, and that is that there's no substitute for hard work. You need to be resilient and flexible, but also determined, and there's nothing that substitutes for a team. That if you think you've got all the answers, you never do, and the closer your team is, and the more you can sort things out and then present a coherent, cohesive force, the better off you are. And frankly, you know, we were able to do that, and on occasions there were some differences of opinion that were obvious on their side, and that is, you know, you realize that that having a strong team and sticking together is really what pays off at the end of the day, and hard work. You just have to do it.
Ambassador, I think on behalf of everyone who knows you in this room, and I know you know a lot of people, I think we all know how important you were in those negotiations. I think we owe you huge thanks for what you did for your country and the resilience you brought to bear in the last 2 years. And it's been a great pleasure to see you and talk to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks.
And just before we wrap up for the day, I'd like to, on behalf of everyone here, on behalf of the Greater KW Chamber of Commerce, present both of you with a copy of our book that we did a couple of years ago called County Roots, Global Reach. It's images of Waterloo Region and from a business perspective about community, the aspects of our social services, but also with a prime focus on the business community. We hope you'll read this in good health, and thank you for both participating.
Just before, I know, you know, I'm never supposed to tell stories out of you know, school, and because it gets you into trouble. But I will tell you one, which and I'd also like to say that in addition to having a strong team on your, you know, when you're negotiating, it's really important to have support at home, and you know, in addition to everything I've been through, Leslie has been extraordinarily supportive to me, and notwithstanding the fact that she hasn't been able to see me all that much, but it's been a challenge for her. But my story is that you know, just before Christmas last year, I had dinner with Secretary Tillerson. And anyway, then he got fired. And then after Christmas, Leslie and I had H.R. McMaster and his wife over for dinner, and he got fired. And so when we were going through this whole NAFTA thing, some of the people on the team said to me, "Could you please invite Peter Navarro to dinner?"
Thanks, Dave. That's great. Well, thank you very much to both Robert for your leadership in the Q&A, and to David for making time out of your schedule to come down here with Les. We appreciate it. Again, just before we conclude these events, we are so fortunate to have a great corporate community and civic community that support the work we do at the Greater KW Chamber of Commerce. Thank you again to our title sponsor, BlackBerry Limited, our silver sponsors, BDO Canada and Waterloo EDC, and our bronze sponsors, Gowling WLG and Sun Life Financial, and again to our host, Crown Plaza KW. Thank you for your attendance today. When you leave, please leave your name tag at the desk so we can recycle for the next event. Thanks very much and have a great afternoon.